one of the images, people have heard me use this, is when my life exploded. It was in August of 2005, and that's when Hurricane Katrina came through. And there was just a series of things that occurred. There was first the hurricane and the winds, and then there was the flooding that came from the surge, and then there was the flooding that came from the breaking of the levees. And it just takes some time to understand all of the implications and ramifications. And so before we can start to rebuild, we need some clarity about what's been lost, and that's going to take some time. And so sometimes when couples start working on their marriage too quickly, it's like they're trying to work on a house that hasn't fully experienced all of the implications or the injury that's going to come from the addiction. So we want to address the issues in a way that makes sense.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We are lucky to have with us today, as always, Dr. Greg Miller, our host.
Is it luck?
It is luck. It's a lot of luck. And equally lucky to have our director, Debbie Laaser, with us today. Debbie, so good to have you back with us.
It's been a little while.
It has been a little while. The listeners have been clamoring for your return.
I am sure.
Well, that really can't be proven, but I'm going with it because I think it sounds good. But anyway, we're happy to have you back with us today.
Thanks.
And we've got a couple of exciting topics that we'd like to get into. Starting with this first podcast, we're going to do two back-to-back podcasts today. And in this first one, we'd like to talk about the healing journeys that are involved when any couple is dealing with the husband's sexual addiction. Is as Debbie was saying to us earlier, there are really two journeys that you're addressing, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And one of the things, just for those of you that may not be familiar with Faithful and True, we really have three groups that we work with. We work with men who struggle with sexual addiction. We work with women who are married to them or in significant relationships with them. And then we also work with couples. And so this conversation is really going to address each of those categories or groups of people that we work with, and how we work with them separately, and also how we work with them together, and how sometimes those journeys blend together.
Mm-hmm. And I think it can be confusing for many, because oftentimes they've started with maybe just couples counseling, and they've done that maybe through their church or through a Christian counselor who has focused primarily on the marriage. Mm-hmm. And it seems to create some issues, and we've been trying to sort out why that's so, and what is it about how we go about helping couples here that might be a little bit different.
Right. Well, and I think is that idea of why is that so chaotic or disruptive sometimes when we're starting to focus on the marriage too quickly. And I think the issue is we don't know yet what we're dealing with. Mm-hmm. One of the images, people have heard me use this, is when my life exploded. It was in August of 2005, and that's when Hurricane Katrina came through. And there was just a series of things that occurred. There was first the hurricane and the winds, and then there was the flooding that came from the surge, and then there was the flooding that came from the breaking of the levees. And it just takes some time to understand all of the implications and ramifications. And so before we can start to rebuild, we need some clarity about what's been lost, and that's going to take some time. And so sometimes when couples start working on their marriage too quickly, it's like they're trying to work on a house that hasn't fully experienced all of the implications or the injury that's going to come from the addiction. Mm-hmm. So we want to address the issues in a way that makes sense.
I think also we believe that, to grow a marriage means we're working on being more vulnerable in the relationship, because our vulnerability and being able to share who we are in the relationship, take ownership for things, change things that aren't safe, is all a part of growing a deeper relationship. If there's an addiction or there's anything brought into the marriage where there's a lot of secrets and acting out that aren't healthy for the relationship, it makes sense that we have to deal with that first.
Right.
a lack of safety, a lack of knowledge, a lack of honesty is going to prevent any relationship from really being able to be vulnerable. So
Right.
we need to start with first things first.
Yeah, was the idea that in order for us to be vulnerable, there has to be an aspect of safety. And so maybe the first thing that we're going to be working on is creating safety in the context of the relationship without necessarily working on the marriage yet. But we want to do some things. There's some things that we're wanting to see from the husband. And in our case, we know that men and women can both struggle with addiction. But here at Faithful and True, we primarily work with men who struggle with addiction. And so that's many times when we're talking about addiction, we use a male pronoun. But the reality is we know that the person struggling with addiction has a lot of work to do within themselves and their own recovery to begin to establish a pattern of safety again when that's been taken away.
So it'll be interesting to talk with you, Greg, because we're not married, obviously, but we've both been in marriages where the husband has been the spouse who has struggled with an addiction, and both, Beth and myself have been the wives who have been betrayed. I know when I first start counseling with women, I generally want to make sure that they understand that nothing they do can control, cure, or cause this addiction in their husband. It's something, that comes out of a lot of 12-step work. I remind them that, while they're not responsible for this, and that I brought my little baby hula hoops because I don't even know if you guys can see these out there, but we like to talk about 3 equal hoops here that we work on, and each of the people in the relationship get their own hoop to work on their own life and the decisions they make and the histories they bring to the relationship, and what their behaviors are, whether they like them or not, whether they're walking in a journey that leads them to become the person God calls them to be. And then there's this third hoop, which is really the relationship hoop. And so a lot of times when we put so much focus on the relationship hoop, we forget that we all have our own work to do in our own hoop. And our work is in our own hoop. It's not to go in and clean up house for somebody else's hoop.
Right.
And, talking to women about you can be supportive, and your job is not to go in there and decide what needs to be done to change what's going on over there. Ideally, your husband is going to find his team of people to lead the life and become a sober person if that is his desire.
Right. Well, and so much in the early days for the husband, it really is about his commitment to be on the journey of recovery. And what's true is, for a lot of men, it is understandable and it is also confusing that they can believe that working on their relationship is working on their recovery. And so therefore they want to maybe prioritize the relationship, focus on the relationship, work on the relationship as a substitute for doing their work around the recovery. And one of the things that we want men to understand is actually it's the other way around. When you are working on recovery, you are working on your relationship indirectly. But the reality is there needs to be a lot of stability or some stability in the recovery before your wife can begin to have that safety that we talked about just a moment ago, where she can begin to invest again in the relationship. And so for him to understand that when I go to my meetings, that is working on my marriage. When I am accountable and when I am honest and transparent with the men in my life, that is me working on my marriage. When I go to my therapist and I address those issues of chaos from the past, that is me working on my marriage. And it may not be this immediate response that you're looking for, but it is this idea that when I am getting sober and working recovery, I am working on my marriage.
Well, one of the things that I like to introduce to wives when I'm working with them is that while they didn't cause or cure or can't control these behaviors of their spouse, there is this other relationship that's always going to be there to be worked on called the marriage. And so that's why I call it 2 congruent journeys, really, because I don't want them to believe that all they need to do is sit there and wait while he gets better and stops doing something, and then everything will be fantastic in the marriage, because that's not generally the case. In order to grow a good marriage, we all have work to do. And to figure out how, again, to know ourselves, to know why we do what we do and why we think what we think and what patterns we bring into our relationship, and how to own or how we don't own, or how we always focus on the other person, or what in the heck do we do in there. So there's all kinds of things that we also can be looking at, so that it doesn't mean we don't have things we could learn and grow from.
Right.
And I like for her to get the idea that there are these two congruent journeys, and being able to separate them out so that you're working with your focus in the right place is sometimes the first challenge.
Right.
And isn't the husband working hard in rebuilding trust?
Right. And what's interesting is rebuilding trust isn't something that I do with my spouse. Rebuilding trust is something that I'm doing that then my spouse is able to respond to. You know, it's that idea that we talk about is you cannot get anybody to trust you. And the more that you try to get somebody to trust you, the less trustworthy you appear. What you can do, though, is work on being a trustworthy person, and then your spouse gets to determine whether or not they're going to trust you in that. And again, we just did a podcast on this idea of what our spouse is wanting is to experience us as being different. And the more I try to convince somebody I'm different or perform that I am different, the less they experience me as different, which ultimately is going to create chaos. So from my hoop, using our hoops, I can work on being trustworthy. Then my spouse gets to determine how she wants to respond to that.
Well, I think, again, just getting people on the right roads and what journeys they're on is very helpful in the beginning. And I would think, this question I was going to ask you, do I get to ask a question?
You do.
Yeah,
You do.
I'm not the host, but wouldn't you say that for most husbands who are working on their own addiction recovery, that they also would like to know that doesn't mean that it will make a marriage perfect, that, you know, that still requires work from both of you.
Right.
And I don't know if they come with that hope that there's some identification of things everyone can do to make that part of life better.
Well, you know what's interesting is, especially in the early days of recovery, I see kind of two categories of men. One, men who are so consumed with their shame that they believe they are completely responsible for everything that didn't work in their marriage. And I do think some of them have this belief, if I just figure this out, if I do my recovery, then everything that wasn't working in the marriage will start working again because I'm to blame for everything that's not good in the marriage. There's another end of the pendulum, and it's those men that are so caught up in wanting to identify their wife's contribution to the marriage and why the marriage wasn't working, that it distracts them from really owning their addiction. And it may be that they fully want to own their addiction, and yet they're so afraid that at some point their wife isn't going to own her contribution to the relationship. They're constantly wanting to bring some conversation around to that. And so what we believe is, again, I'm completely responsible for the addiction and my recovery, and if I'm working on that, then that is going to influence our marriage because I'm going to show up in our marriage in a different way, and my spouse is also going to be responsible for how she shows up in the marriage. And some of it may be about timing. You know, if I rush too quickly to want to point out the things that my spouse did that weren't working, it comes across sometimes as if I'm blaming my spouse for the addiction. And so it is that timing that says, my spouse has enough confidence in my recovery, and she is safe enough again to really begin looking at the relationship again.
So where do we go from here?
Well, one thing I will add, Beth and I just had this conversation in the car the other day, and there is this timing piece where the husband has been working his recovery, he has been committed, he is being transformed, and there reaches a point where there is an invitation to the wife to begin to look at her contribution to the coupleship. And that, I believe, from a spouse's perspective, is a very scary place to be, where they too are seeing that their spouse is changing. They are aware that things are being different. And yet it's scary to think about entering back into that couples hoop and starting to own some of the things that they have done that create chaos in the relationship. And so that's one of those places where when a woman is working with a professional or has a group, we want to validate that that's scary, and with some support, that is some fear that they can move towards.
So I guess what we're saying, this whole thing is a sticky wicket, as
Yes.
we like to say here at Faithful and True, is how do we eventually get on the journey where we're both wanting to just be gentle observers of our life and our relationship, because that is the place where we get to practice all of who we are and what we bring. So we might start noticing that we tend to withdraw a lot, or we haven't shared much of what we're thinking. I was just talking to several wives today who were really ending up talking about patterns of the marriage rather than issues of addiction in the marriage. And so I try to point that out to them, that these are just things that are eventually really nice to look at, because they're there whether the addiction is there or not. And so once you start looking at those, it gives you a lot of things to decide in your marriage what you guys want to work on changing, so that we don't keep repeating generationally some of these patterns that are really unhealthy. And
Are there some ways that you have found it helpful to support a wife to move towards that fear when she does have a sense that her husband is working a program of recovery? She has some level of confidence that he is committed. She is hearing an invitation, to, whether it's within herself or from God or from her husband, to re-engage the couples hoop. Are there some things that you have found helpful to support a wife to move towards that fear?
well, I think the encouragement is always just to know herself better and to like herself better. And I think this would be true for anybody. As we work on healthier things we do and believe in, we tend to show up and have better behaviors and more empathy and more love for others. And as we work towards that, and we can take that with us, I think it's just a real joy. We can begin to live more in that place, too, of our own truth of being fearfully and wonderfully made, which I think many of us struggle with anyway. But as we work on these things in our relationships, are going to be the place where they come up because we get triggered. And when we get triggered, as we start making choices for ourselves about how to respond in that trigger, we either like ourselves better, or we start saying things like, I can't even believe I said that, or I did that. I feel so guilty, or I never do that. I don't know why I'm doing that now. To begin there and start working on things so that at least for myself, I like who I am when I'm leaving these situations. And I think that becomes really important, and something you get to take with you wherever you go in whatever relationship you're in, which can be nice for a wife who doesn't know where her husband's recovery might be taking him.
Right.
And
So it's almost like, can I be the best version of myself? Whether I say yes to the invitation to step back in the couples hoop, or I say no, I'm trusting myself, I'm trusting God's Spirit in me, my intuition, and I'm responding to the invitation with my best version of myself.
exactly, yeah.
One thing that back to that conversation that Beth and I were having is, so there's a moment or moments where the wife hears an invitation to step back into the couples hoop, and one of the things that Beth identified is how she stewards that moment is telling, because if she is prompted to say yes, and she listens to her fear and says no, in time, that no can lead to her own bitterness and resentment, and it's almost like indulging the fear and giving the fear more power. And then what can also happen is, if I said no, and really it is safe enough, there's no guarantee, but it's safe enough, I then begin to need to justify my no, which may actually send me into that nitpicking and identifying all the things that my spouse isn't doing right. So, what's true is when we have those opportunities, there's a cost to saying yes. That is very scary. But there's also a cost to the wife to say no, and how that may land in her in the months or the years to come.
Do you mean saying no to working on the marriage?
Yes,
I
yes.
see. Okay. Yeah. And, one of the things as a counselor we're going to want to visit, at least I do, with someone who would say no, is what is it about her that's not ready for that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the response I often hear the most is that she wants to see her husband be more invested in his work first. And that makes total understanding, I think, to me, that she has often felt like she's done more than her share anyway of trying to heal a marriage or bring up things to talk about or whatever it is. And she just wants to see his devotion to being a different person.
Would you also say that consciously or unconsciously, sometimes women are hesitant to step back into the couples hoop because they need some sort of validation or kind of a clear signal that he's committed even if she's not in the couples hoop. That she's needing to know that we talk about this internal motivation. He's willing to do this whether she invests in the couple hoop or not. And so if she says no and he gives up on recovery or diminishes or limits his investment in recovery, that's kind of a signal that maybe he's not ready. But if she says no, I'm not ready, but he just continues with his recovery, that gives her some reassurance that, yes, this is a good time for us to step into the couples hoop.
Yeah, it's like building trust in honoring her no, whatever it's about. And that's not in and of itself going to change his trajectory to become the person he wants to become. So yes, I think sometimes maybe it can be a bit of a test for that. I think also, though, there can be women that might be reluctant to step into that marriage hoop because there's not much hope that comes from society. And what I mean by that is, the internet, I think, and what's out there is still rather hopeless for a lot of women who are doing searches out there.
Right.
And it's really hard to hear. I mean, I just talked to someone very recently who said, they've been reading all over the place that they really don't believe you'll ever be able to trust your husband again. Or that he will never be sober entirely. He'll always slip and slide still. Things that we don't believe here. But there's still an awful lot of that information out on the internet. And so wives don't really have a lot of hope that marriage could be all that fabulous. Like one I talked with today said, I don't really want to go back into a marriage where I can't trust completely. I'd rather be alone. And I said, well, what if that's not a truth, though? What if you could build trust? And if we could help you with that here because we work on that all the time, well, that she would be willing.
Right. And I've heard y'all talk about this, and it may not be the right language, but the goal isn't to trust completely. The goal is to trust enough to invest. Because you're going to have to help me with what the phrase y'all use, but it's not naive trust, it's not foolish trust.
Right.
But it's this idea that it's informed and wise trust. I have enough information, I've experienced him different enough that I'm willing to trust enough, to be vulnerable enough to see what intimacy might be possible. And again, it's not diving into the deep end of the pool. It's little baby steps towards that vulnerability as you are feeling safe enough to see what else might be possible.
Yeah, and it's actually growing trust so that it's not that simplistic trust, but it's that complicated trust that also is going to involve some new ways to trust, including learning to trust herself and trusting God in her relationship, not just him.
Right.
And so that is much more complicated and requires a lot more work. But ultimately, it is not an expectation that he will never, ever do anything that she doesn't like.
Right.
Or, she seems that she would deem as a failure or whatever. I'm not necessarily talking about acting out and accepting that, but I'm talking about, I think our expectations when we use the word trust can grow to mean he will never, ever, ever do anything I don't like again. That's not realistic.
Right. Well, and using our language, in a perfect world, as a spouse, I would never show up as a survivor. That's just not true. If Beth were here, she could provide some examples where in my anxiety, my fear, whatever gets triggered, I can show up in some of those survivor strategies. And you're right, it's not about some of the old history of addiction. And I'm in this journey of becoming the man that God created me to be in life and marriage, and I'm just not fully at that place yet. But when I do show up as a survivor, it's that I hope I'm able to also show up with repair and ownership so that we are able to move on. It's just not a recycling of the past.
Yeah.
And again, I want to say this clearly. What we're talking about is inviting people, women, to consider stepping into the couples hoop once they have confidence or more confidence in their husband's recovery and sobriety. This is down the road. This is why we're talking about these two stages. So stage one is the husband is really working a program of recovery. He's being transformed. His wife is experiencing him as different. She's doing the work that she needs to heal from the betrayal and the chaos that that's created. And she's gotten to the place where there's enough confidence to be able to step into that couple's hoop. And I think I imagine the question when a wife gets to that place is, how can I know that he will never hurt me or betray me again? And the inability to answer that question is part of what creates the hesitancy, is what I would assume.
Right. And I think you're right. Stage one for the wives is really about focusing on healing and healing the pain of trauma and loss in their life and the impact of what they haven't known for quite some time. And we don't want to rush, the marriage work and the patterns we've created in our lives from some of our earlier life experiences before we've had a time to do that grieving and talking and being heard and understood. So it can be a slower process than maybe many men would like.
Right. I can guarantee you that.
Yeah.
That for men who look towards their wives for reassurance and validation and safety and identity, it is very scary to be in this season of uncertainty. And so one of the things that we're working with the men is this idea of you can be safe even if your wife isn't able to invest in the relationship yet because your value, identity, and safety don't come from your wife. That's one of the things we're wanting them to get unhooked from, because if I need for you to save me, I'm going to be very reluctant to give you the space you need to try to figure out what you need in order to move forward.
Yeah.
Well, that seems like a great segue or break as we look towards our next podcast, where we're going to talk about what the second stage is. And one other caveat I want to add is the stage one, we still work with couples in stage one. We don't necessarily work on the marriage. We work on supporting the coupleship as they navigate the complexity of being in relationship with someone that has betrayed you. So this can be more about logistics. This can be about language. This can be about resources. So we do work with couples, and we see this as very important because couples that are getting support in this stage are much more likely to be able to get to the second stage. Couples who aren't getting any help in their coupleship when there's so much pain and chaos, it makes perfect sense. They struggle because there's no one helping them navigate the pain and the chaos.
And I think it's a time, too, where we can create vision for them, and knowing that for right now, we're not going to go actively after it, but we're going to teach them various pieces of getting in the right hoops at the right time, dealing with the right stuff that belongs to us, and getting the resources in order to do that. So building that community for each one of them, all really important first steps.
Okay.
Well, Deb, thank you so much for joining us again today. It's always wonderful to have you on the podcast. And Greg, as usual, brilliant. That's all we can say. We'd like to thank most of all our listeners for being so loyal and to watch, for listening and watching our podcasts. We do this for you. And as we say in so many of our marketing efforts, if you find yourself struggling with these issues, we can help. And this is why we're here. We invite you to visit faithfulandtrue.com. Take a look at the resources we have available to you. We have over 400 of these podcasts. We also have our online bookstore with all of the available books by Mark and Debbie Laaser, as well as a terrific book by Beth Miller, Greg's wife. And all of these resources are available to you. We also invite you to take a look at our workshops. That we have a lot of information about our intensive workshops, and we offer the Men's Journey Workshop every month. So take a look at that. If you're a man that's struggling with unwanted sexual behaviors, take a look at the Men's Journey Workshop. We also have the Women's Journey Workshop, which is coming up at the end of this month. And we invite you to take a look at the information on the website about that. So until we join you again with part 2 of this podcast, we hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.